When Germany's POWs saw Detroit, the day U.S. industry broke their calculations. Dash, content note, wartime captivity and ideology. No graphic detail. Kısımber. The harbor glowed like a furnace at shift change. Cranes swung above the water. Derricks clanked. Barges snorted through black wake. Hans Keller pressed his forehead to the salt-scratched porthole as a military police sergeant barked names behind him. Someone near the bulkhead whispered in German. Half contempt, half awe. America! Hans had spent 2 years feeding a war with numbers, tonnage and rails and fuel turned into neat margins of victory. Tonight, with the skyline rising like racks of tooling, the numbers felt like sand slipping between his fingers. At the Hoboken terminal, lamps painted the planks yellow and hard. Name, unit, theater, the MP drummed. When Hans said, engineering student, logistics clerk, the stamp thudded, Trans-Midwest. A red-haired GI with Detroit stitched over his heart grinned as though it were an inside joke with history. Don't worry, fellas. Geneva rules. You'll eat better than we do. Propaganda, Otto muttered, a Feldwebel with stubble and an iron jaw. Hans didn't answer. A freight rolled past on the farther track. Flat cars chained with tanks like steel beetles, 30, 40, 50. The headlamps burned white holes through his old assumptions. The night train rattled west. Wool, coal smoke, and a clean sawdust smell crowded the car. Guard Sergeant Frank O'Hara leaned in the doorway, cap cocked, eyes the color of cold lake water. Engineers, huh? Then you'll like your tour. River Rouge, maybe Willow Run. See a line run not in a pamphlet. Theater, Otto said again. Sure, O'Hara said with a wink. Theater with rivets. Farm lights went by like beads on a wire. Another freight, reefers, boxcars, gondolas, hammered the dark. Hans raised a pencil trying to convert axle counts to tonnage, tonnage to days, days to divisions. The rhythm of the rails mocked him gently. You don't have numbers for this. Fort Custer wore a first skin of snow and the smell of oatmeal and oiled wood. A Swiss Red Cross delegate with a winter pink nose counted bunks and spoke in politely neutral French and German. Letters are allowed. Labor is non-military. Treatment will be correct. Karl, a farmer from Hesse, lifted his mess tray and studied the smear of yellow on bread. Butter, he said like a man greeting a lost friend. Theater, Otto muttered, but he ate carefully, like someone afraid a dream might notice and vanish. Work detail came before the camp settled into a routine. A sugar beet field near Battle Creek with frost lifting off the black dirt in brittle curls. The American foreman, Mr. Whitman, passed tin mugs of coffee. Geneva says I pay you in canteen credits. You do right by me, I do right by you. Karl kissed the steam. Hans worked the fork and watched a tractor hauling a mechanical harvester cough beets into a wagon faster than 2 squads of men could toss. On the road, a freight inched by with cases stenciled rations. C.K.D. He heard himself make a small, unmilitary sound. What is it? Otto snapped. I used to think food was the one weapon you couldn't mass-produce, Hans said. I was wrong. At the camp cinema, a wartime newsreel rattled on a hung sheet. Willow Run, a plane an hour. The narrator boomed over women in coveralls guiding a bomber wing toward inspection. Laughter, scoffs, arguments flared in the dark like struck matches. Dieter, the quiet mathematician, murmured as if in a seminar. If they solved bottlenecks and labor balance, the claim isn't impossible. They lie, Otto said, but the word had a seam of doubt stitched across it. In the administrative hut, a lieutenant read names like inventory. Keller, Dieter, Otto. Voluntary educational tour. The Swiss delegate raised a hand. Permissible under the convention if they consent. Hans nodded. Pride pulled at Otto like a bad tendon, but he nodded too. Better to see the enemy's theater and know where the paint ended. Dearborn announced itself by taste before sight. the iron penny tang of coke ovens and wet steam. The Ford River Rouge sat on the river like a continent. Blast furnaces flaming dull orange, rolling mills humming through their teeth, powerhouse breathing like a sleeping animal. From or to car in one zip code, O'Hara said. It's impossible, Dieter whispered, precisely because it stood there. A glass corridor above the hot strip mill roasted their faces. Red slabs, bread loaves of steel, slid to the rollers, throwing heat against the glass. A woman with a badge that read E. Price caught Hans's stare and gave a small, unafraid wave. He waved back, absurdly grateful for the normality of it. In a briefing room that smelled of coffee and chalk dust, a manager with sleeves rolled showed them a wall map webbed with routes. Ore from Minnesota, coal from Appalachia, limestone from up the road.
Switchers feed blessed furnaces.
Billets to mills, coils to stamping, panels to assembly. We're not one factory. We're a continent pretending to be a room. We don't chase perfection, we chase tack time. Good enough every hour, forever. Forever?
Hans murmured.
As long as coffee holds, O'Hara said, half joke, half creed. Lunch looked indecent to men raised on ersatz. Real meat, mustard, an apple that snapped. E. Price came over, cap in hand, posture that said she held a station and liked it.
I'm Evelyn.
Nights I run a crew on the mill. You build planes? Carl asked, amazed. I build pieces. The line builds planes. In Germany, a cog is an insult, Dieter said carefully. Here it means your kid brother comes home sooner, she said, simple as a rivet. Home sat in Hans's chest like a bird that couldn't decide whether to fly. Ypsilanti spread flat as a hand. Willow Run lay across it like a story told straight. Cameras were forbidden. The tour path snaked behind chain link and polite MPs. The noise made their ribs tight. Stations ticked forward with the clock's cruelty and mercy. Jig to skin, mount to check, fastener to inspection. Hans couldn't help counting. Minutes divided by tasks, tasks multiplied by stations. Somewhere inside, a stress rivet in his spirit popped. We can't bomb this many hours, he whispered, and hated the accuracy of it. A torque wrench at station 43 failed its calibration. No panic, no grand halt. A runner arrived, a spare clicked into a hand. A QC pad was initialed, and the line blurred forward like a river swallowing a fallen branch. Evelyn, different cap, same stance, nodded to an inspector. Don't you need to stop everything? Hans asked through the fence. We stop in slices, she said. 1,000 tiny halts that don't become one catastrophe. Dieter closed his eyes as if in prayer. Little stoppages defeat big failures. There's your war right there, O'Hara said. Not flags. This, a liberator smelled of solvents and fresh paint as it nosed toward daylight. A few claps, then hands returned to their tasks without speech or pose. Otto glared as if the aircraft had insulted him by existing. Where are your shortages? Over there. Evelyn pointed at a whiteboard titled Constraints. Rubber last week. Copper the week before. Men sometimes. We treat 'em like headaches. Hydrate. Aspirin, keep working. Hans let out a breath he hadn't known he'd held. The whiteboard reassured him more than the spectacle did. They weren't gods. They were stubborn. Back at camp, the stove pinged like cooling sheet metal. A small card was pinned to Hans's bunk. KMERADN scrawled in blunt pencil. Comrade Swine. Otto lifted it with 2 fingers and put it back without comment. They think you're collaborating, he said. I looked at machines, Hans said, and I saw a future. Their future, Otto spit. Or ours if we live long enough to borrow it. On letters night, the censors stamped envelopes like bailiffs. Dear Mutter, Hans wrote, then paused. He wanted to describe a city that turned or into wings, but he chose the smaller truths they would pass. Food sufficient, treatment correct, work not harsh. He added a line that felt indecently honest. There is more here than we were told. He signed with a steadying hand and watched the stove's soft blue eye blink. The Swiss delegate walked them to the wire where maples stood like black comb teeth. A night manifest roared, then softened into a long iron breath. Carl recited crop names in a whisper: wheat, corn, soy, as if counting saints. They don't bomb here, Carl said. The fields and factories go on. We have ruins instead of roofs, Hans said, and felt the words place their weight. War is geography. Mr. Aby buttoned his coat. Sometimes that's all the strategy there is. O'Hara slid a chipped mug across the wire. Don't make me write this up as contraband. Just drink it. Why show us? Hans asked. Why not keep us ignorant? Ignorance is heavy, O'Hara said. We got enough to carry. Maybe knowing something changes a head or two. Maybe after this you go home and build washers, not war. The coffee tasted like a small contract with the future. He found the chapel empty and cool. Oil and old candle smoke gave the air a smell like polished patience. He wasn't devout, but he whispered anyway, if numbers are real, mercy must be 2, or why should we count? On the way out he saw Evelyn through the fence, a fast nod in the winter light. He didn't know how to nod back in a way that included the thanks he couldn't write past the censors. So he just lifted a hand and watched her vanish into shift change. Word went around that the Americans had posted a notice, orientation hour for POWs who wanted to understand American industry and law. No compulsion, it said in English, German, and French. The posting drew 2 kinds of men, the curious and the furious. Otto read it and said nothing. Later, in the dark between bunks, the furious men whispered about betrayal and resolve. The curious men whispered about lathe speeds and wages. Hans listened with his eyes shut, measuring the angles words took through a room. The next afternoon brought a dry wind and a scraping sound in the tools shed that sat just inside the wire. Hans went to fetch a broom for the barracks and heard the scrape again. Hushed and hurried. He opened the door. 2 men from the transport, men loyal to a lost banner, snapped upright. One tucked something under a tarp with the sly, stiff posture of guilt. The orientation hut will burn. One hissed, not as a confession but as a promise to himself. They cannot parade us like schoolboys. Hans shut the door slowly, heart drumming. He could go to O'Hara. He could find the Swiss. He could do nothing and let rage make a lesson out of timber and kerosene and rumor. He stood in the brittle light with the broom in his hand, feeling the entire war balance on the wooden handle. At supper, Carl's laugh came from a far table like a rescue rope. He was telling a story about a horse that could open a latch. Men shook their heads as if remembering a world where the only trick was a clever animal. Hans carried his tray to the stove and let its warmth climb into his sleeves. Otto came to stand beside him, stare straight ahead, and speak without moving his lips. There are men who think pain is the only tutor. They want to make a lesson of tonight. And you? I think the line at Willow Run is a better teacher, Otto said. But I am not the man to stand between angry men and their habits. Then I am, Hans said, surprising himself with the shape of the sentence. The wind sharpened after dark. The orientation hut sat at the edge of the yard with a thin shine in its windows, a potbelly stove inside ticking like a tired clock. The translator had laid out papers. The American lieutenant had practiced his careful speech about laws and wages and unions. A few men gathered early, coats buttoned, impatience tucked under their elbows. Hans stood outside the door and watched the shadows lengthen near the tools shed. He imagined kerosene finding a seam in dry wood, imagined the smoke crawling along the rafters, imagined the Americans answering fury with more rules and higher fences and less coffee. He moved. He left the door half open so voices could flow. Legal terms like Geneva and compensation, practical ones like canteen credits and safety, and strode for the shed. The yard gravel squeaked under his boots. Every footfall said choose, choose, choose. He thought of the wall map in the Ford office, of lines that were not borders but routes. of Evelyn with her cap and clean nod, of O'Hara's tired humor, of the letter to his mother and the indecent truth inside it. When he reached the shed, a figure stepped out, cap pulled low, shoulders set. "You will do nothing," the man said. "This is honor." "Honor is a job done when you hate it," Hans said. "Honor is a line that keeps moving because one wrench gets replaced." "You want their respect," the man sneered. "I want our future," Hans said. "And that's heavier." Behind him, the orientation hut door thumped as men entered. Inside, the stove ticked, paper rustled, voices found a shape. Hans kept his hands where the guards could see them if anyone looked. Empty, palms open, a man with only words. The other prisoner's mouth hardened around an old oath. He stepped sideways, just enough to show he'd been to the tarp and could go again. Hans took one more step, hearing the gravel announce him, hearing the wind carry the word "choose" down into the marrow of the camp. Hashtag Kism2. The wind pulled at the yard like a hand trying to erase it. Hans stood with his palms open, the wood smell of the shed and the cold metal scent of the lock mingling in his throat. Inside the orientation hut, a chair scraped, paper shuffled. The translator cleared his voice. Out here, the other prisoner's eyes were two hard splinters. "You think you can talk us out of a fire?" The man said. "I think you can talk yourself out of a prison sentence," Hans answered, keeping his voice low so anger had to lean in to hear it. "You've seen their courts. You've seen the Swiss. If you burn their hut, you won't teach them anything about honor. You'll only teach them we cannot be trusted with matches or mercy." The man's jaw worked. Somewhere to the left, another shadow shifted, the second conspirator, hands dug in his pockets like he was holding the last warmth on earth. "They parade us," the first said. "They want our heads to bow." "Look at me," Hans said. "My head isn't bowed. I looked, and I came back with a spine and a headache. You want to fight? Fight like an engineer. Make a better plan than kerosene." The second shadow laughed once, a sound too dry to be cruel. "He wants to build washers, not war." "Yes," Hans said, surprised by the relief of saying it aloud. "Washers that don't break and keep a mother's hands out of winter water. That's victory that lasts longer than any parade." Boots ground the gravel behind them. Sergeant O'Hara did not shout. He stopped where the lamplight reached his boots and said, soft as a confession, "Fellas, this the line you want to cross?" Silence pressed on the three of them like more wind. O'Hara kept his hands visible, empty. "I can call the whole watch," he went on. "Or I can pretend I took the long way round the yard and met nobody and nothing but the weather. That choice ain't mine. It's yours. And time's short because that stove in there is hungry for more wood." The conspirator's shoulders dropped an inch. The other kicked at the dirt and found no miracle under it. Hans watched something invisible tilt. "Forget it," the first man muttered. He turned, not quick, not slow, and walked toward the barracks with the stubborn dignity of a man postponing his worst idea. The other followed, hands still in pockets, anger settling like ash instead of flame. O'Hara let out a breath that might have been half whistle, half prayer. "I owe you nothing," Hans said. "You owe me coffee in a country I ain't seen yet," O'Hara said, then nodded toward the hut. "Go learn the words they're about to teach you. You'll need them later more than I do." Inside, the room was warmer than its size. The translator spoke steady German. The lieutenant did not try to be friendly, only clear. Wages, canteen credits, hours, health and safety. The Geneva Convention's exact clauses like teeth that fit together when you set them right. The Swiss delegate stood against the wall with his small notebook open, metronome pen ready. At the end, questions. Angry ones first, accusations like old artillery shells fired out of habit. Patient answers. Then cautious questions. How much for beat work? How many letters allowed? Could a man ask for farm duty near a certain town? Hans listened like a man learning a second grammar, all verbs made of paper. File, appeal, report, witness. When it was over, he stepped into the cold and found Otto waiting with his collar up. "You didn't call the guards," Otto said. "I called the future," Hans answered. It answered in bad boots and an Irish grin.
Otto's mood twitched.
"The line at Willow Run was more dangerous than I thought. Puts ideas on your tongue. Then we are both armed." Days lengthened into work, letters, the slow, starched routine of being useful while history gnashed its teeth somewhere else. Hans spent 2 weeks on the beet farm, then a stint in a sawmill detail where the sweet ache of pine pitch soaked into his sleeves. He was learning American nouns as much as he was learning how to bend his back without breaking his pride. Gasket, union, grievance, overtime. Some nights he dreamed in numbers and woke in sawdust. Evelyn wrote once, through the Red Cross, 2 bland paragraphs the censors wouldn't bruise, but he recognized her compact, exact hand. "Our line adds stoppages where they belong instead of letting them ambush us," she wrote. "I thought you would appreciate that sentence." He did. He copied it into his small notebook and underlined it twice. One afternoon, Mr. Aby asked for volunteers to help inventory the camp workshop. Hans raised his hand. He liked counting when counting wasn't about shells. The workshop smelled of oil, iron filings, and the faint faraway hope of a bicycle. On a shelf under a tarp, he found 3 wrenches machined by different hands to solve the same problem. He thought of Willow Run's spare that had turned a catastrophe into a slice, and wanted to write a footnote praising redundancy. At supper, Carl told a story about a farm dog that had learned to sleep under the stove because that was where life kept returning. Men laughed the way men do when they have almost forgotten how. Otto chewed slowly, watching the room like a sergeant even when there was nobody left to order. Dieter drew on a scrap, ratios that meant something about cues and patience. Winter loosened. A thaw turned the yard to a gray paste, and trucks came more often, taking details to farms, mills, to a cannery where the smell of tomatoes and iron kettles lifted spirits like a song. Rumor said tours continued for officers and engineering students, educational visits that were half propaganda, half offer. If propaganda was a chain, the offer was a door. Not every man wanted either. One evening a fight broke at the far end of the barracks. Words first, collaborator, coward, heater of enemy engines, then fists in the defiant schoolyard way of men who'd lost a larger war and wanted a smaller victory. O'Hara and 2 MPs shouldered in, sharp and brief. Nobody was eager to bleed for the privilege of bleeding. The next day the Swiss posted a notice. Internal discipline would be handled through a camp committee with POW representation. Mr. Aby chairing, 2 Americans observing, 3 POWs elected by secret ballot. Hans did not run. He was nominated anyway. Otto did run, scowled through a terse speech about order and dignity, and won in a landslide. Carl cheered for whoever would keep soup hot and tempers cooler. Dieter shook his head at politics, then agreed to be secretary because he trusted paper more than people. The first case was small. Stolen canteen credits, a pack of cigarettes gone missing, a coat switched and not switched back. The committee grounded itself in rules that felt like tools. Hear both sides, write it down, choose a remedy that fixed the leak rather than sinking the boat. The guilty man did extra latrine duty and apologized with the tight pride of a man who would not write that word voluntarily but would say it to keep his bunk. The second case was not small. The men who had muttered about fire faced the committee. They avoided Hans's eyes. They avoided everyone's. They were angry that the plan had collapsed into a conversation. Angry that the camp had declined to become a lesson in smoke and sirens. They wanted to plead honor. Otto, in the chair, cut through that plea like a man chopping kindling. "You set a match to a hut where paper lives," he said. "The Swiss's paper. Our paper. The paper that keeps our meat portion the size it is and our letters the number they are. That hut is our lungs. Don't tell me it was about honor. Tell me you were sick with the habit of fire." The men stared at the floorboards. One said, almost childlike, "I was tired of being taught." "Then teach back," Otto said. "Better than fire. Words that move something besides smoke." The remedy wasn't punishment. It was work. Those men would serve on the committee for 2 months, listening to other men's complaints until listening regrew in them like a lost muscle. They would attend every orientation hour. They would write, by hand, the camp rules twice, not as humiliation but as memory work. The Americans accepted it. The Swiss approved it. O'Hara shrugged with a faint grin. If only I could solve my platoon that way. Spring roused the fields fully. On a farm near Jackson, Hans stacked crates of eggs while the farmer's wife, Mrs. Baker, talked as if conversation were a chore you did with care. "My boy's in the Pacific," she said, sliding a box toward him. "I don't hate you. Hate's heavy. Carry flour, not hate." Hans said, "I am sorry." She nodded once, the American nod he had learned. A hinge of acknowledgement that didn't force more. "You write your mother, Mr. Keller?" "When I can." "Then carry letters like you carry eggs. Straight. Don't let your hands invent a tremor they don't have." He carried that sentence back to camp like a holy object. He did not know if his mother received his letters, but he wrote them as if the act itself could lay down track between ruined roofs and a place where roofs were factories' second skin. More tours came and went. Evelyn stayed on the line, a name that meant the line would keep moving. Once, during a stop at River Rouge, Hans saw her again through the glass of a different corridor. She lifted her hand. He lifted his. Nothing to say that the censors would allow, nothing to say that would not add weight to the guards' notebooks. A nod was enough. It had to be. War news arrived like weather. The front bent, then bent again. Town names were spoken quietly, like the names of ill relatives. An officer in the camp stood up in the mess one afternoon and read a bulletin. Allied troops had crossed a river whose name sounded like a door unlatching. Rhine. Men put their spoons down. The world tilted another degree. And then the day came when a different bulletin was read in the same voice. Germany had surrendered. The mess hall did not cheer. Some men wept. Most did not. It was like learning a fever had broken in a house where the roof sagged with rain. A relief that let cold in. They were prisoners of a war that was now a memory and a map. Repatriation became a new word in the yard. Trucks, lists, a scaling down of routines. Men talked of what waited: rubble, debt, cousins, soil. Some talked of nothing, as if silence were the only bag big enough to carry the weight. O'Hara came to the fence with coffee because that was how he said anything that mattered. "So, Professor," he said, not unkind, "what do you build when you go home?" "Washers," Hans said, "and lines that stop in slices. And maybe a union that quits yelling only when it's time to yell," O'Hara said with a half-smile. "Say hi to your ma. Tell her some Irish mug in Michigan says she raised a stubborn one. She'll say she already knew." "She will," O'Hara said, tipping his cap. The Swiss delegate shook hands at the gate like a man closing a ledger he had grown fond of. "Right, if the workshop becomes a factory," Mr. Aby said. "I like to keep my files alive." On the last morning, Hans folded his small notebook and put it in the lining of his jacket where the censors wouldn't rummage. He left the orientation hut as he had found it. Chairs in rows, stove clean, papers squared. He pressed a palm to the stovetop the way a man greets a faithful animal and did not know if that was superstition or gratitude. The train east was quieter than the one that had brought them west, as if the steel had remembered how to sigh. Through Ohio and Pennsylvania he watched industrial valleys pull their threads into the distance. He thought of the wall map in Dearborn and understood at last that maps were not lines with flags but arteries with pressure. He slept with his cheek against a coat that still smelled faintly of pine pitch and American laundry soap. Home announced itself at first by what was missing. Streets that recalled a toothless grin. Stations with windows boarded like blind eyes. A house that might once have held the precise tyranny of furniture and now held air and dust. He found his mother in a flat where the stove worked when you pleaded and the roof kept most of the rain out. Her hands were the color of weak tea and the shape of perseverance. "You are thinner," she said, touching his sleeve like she was locating him by braille. But your words are heavier. He told her about fields that fed railcars, trains that fed furnaces, furnaces that fed lines, lines that fed skies. He did not say River Rouge and Willow Run. He said, a city that turns ore into wings and butter into morale. She nodded as if that sentence made soup. Work was rubble first, shoveling bricks into neat humiliation. Then it was a machine shop cobbled from survivors. One lathe, one drill press, 2 benches, a wall with a future mapped in pencil. The owner, her Voight, had a scar that made smiling look like bravery. You've seen American plants, he said. Teach us how not to worship them. They don't want worship, Hans said. They want flow. They started with buckets. Reliable, stackable, the kind that carried water, mortar, and patience. Then drain traps and stovepipe elbows and a dozen small, necessary objects that could be made from sheet and will. At every station Hans introduced stoppages where they belonged instead of letting them become catastrophes. A spare wrench here, a jig there, a chalkboard labeled constraints because words could travel well. Otto arrived 2 months later, a duffel over his shoulder, a look like a man who had misplaced his war and was not yet ready to put his hands in peacetime. He stood in the doorway, looked at the buckets, the chalkboard, the line that moved because one hand did not think it was nobler than the next, and grunted. You need a foreman who shouts only when it matters. I need a man who recognizes a bottleneck from across the room, Hans said. Same man, different hat, Otto replied, and took off his coat. Carl came with a letter from Mrs. Baker folded 12 times inside his cap. We finished the harvest. She had written in cramped English he had copied twice to get right. We hope your bread rises. Hate is heavy. He showed it to Hans like a relic. Dieter became a teacher because ratios deserved a classroom. Everyone built something that did not explode. The first washer did not look like a prophecy. It looked like a compromise. An awkward drum in a boxy shell, enamel that needed a second coat, a motor that hummed an uncertain note. But it washed a small load of a neighbor's shirts and blinked awake something like joy. The second washer looked less embarrassed. The third began to resemble a future you could sell without apology. Arbeitsschutz became a word on the wall. Safety not a sermon, but as a list of things you did as casually as you breathed. Guards on belts, goggles on eyes, rests for hands. A union formed not to fight an enemy but to set hours like fence posts. The chalkboard under constraints began to look like a calendar. Steel short next week. Bearings in 2. Solution. Rework station 5. Order extra fasteners. Teach Otto not to hoard wrenches. A letter came through the Red Cross stamped with a Detroit return that made Hans sit down before opening it. Evelyn wrote, I saw a washer in a window on Werner Highway that looked like it had decided to be a citizen. If you are building such things wherever you are, good. The line runs. We stop in slices when we must. I thought you would appreciate that sentence. He underlined it again. Years blur when they are the right kind. The shop became a floor, the floor a wing, the wing part of a building that hummed more than it complained. The chalkboard became a habit inside heads. Men went home with bad backs but not with bad faith. Women, war widows and war-weary, took stations and rules and payday as seriously as a sacrament. Children put their palms on the warm top of a running washer, not to pray, but perhaps that wasn't different. One day a visitor stepped onto the floor with a neutral notebook and a neat pen. Age had polished him to a softer shine. Mr. Aby looked across at Hans like a man spotting a correctly filed document in a long drawer. You wrote, he said. I keep my files alive. Hans showed him the line, spare wrenches in their places, the board with its honest ailments. He showed him the lounge with a bulletin about hours and a dog-eared copy of a safety instruction leaflet that somebody had underlined like a poem. He did not show him pride because pride didn't need a tour. It lived on the floor and punched in before the bell. The court of numbers seems to have agreed with you, Aby said mildly. And the court of mercy? Hans thought of a night with a shed, Two men learning how not to light a match they could not control. An Irish sergeant who pretended the long way around was the only way he knew. He thought of Evelyn's nod through glass and a letter that didn't say what it meant in order to mean it more. Both courts were open, he said. We tried to show up for both. When he walked Mr. Aby to the door, a crate on a dolly rolled past. Washers bound for a town that had not known the inside of a factory before the war blew ceilings off mines. The crate had a stencil someone had insisted on. Handle like history. He stood a long time after the door closed, listening to the floor. The sound of work was softer than the sound of war, but it filled him more completely. He pulled his small squared notebook from the place it lived now, a clean drawer by a clean bench, and wrote one more line under all the others he had kept. When we saw Detroit, our calculations broke. So we made new ones that included mercy, and the math held. ##### practical checklist. Turning conflict into constructive systems. For storytellers and civic projects. 1. Name the bottlenecks, not the enemies. Use a visible constraints board, physical or digital. Problems lose glamour and gain fixability when written down. 2. Stop in slices. Build microstoppages, quick swaps, spare tools, short audits, to prevent catastrophic halts. On assembly lines, in teams, in classrooms. 3. Make rules you can point at. Do process panels with outside observers if possible. Reduce rumor and retaliation. Post decisions. Explain remedies. 4. Replace punishment with participation. Where safe, convert would-be saboteurs into stewards. Rotate them through listening and responsibility until the habit sticks. 5. Keep redundancy honest. One spare tool per critical step. One alternate plan per major deliverable. Redundancy isn't waste, it's insurance. 6. Write letters like rails. Document agreements, safety habits, and lessons learned as if a future version of your team will need to travel them. 7. Teach the grammar of dignity. Pay fairly, post hours, enforce safety. People who aren't humiliated don't need fire to be heard. 8. Export what heals. After conflict, build washers, not war. Products, programs, or stories that serve daily life and outlast noise. 9. Keep a neutral witness. Invite a Swiss, a trusted third party, to observe key processes. It stabilizes trust when tempers rise. 10. Measure mercy alongside throughput. Track not only units/hour but grievances resolved, accidents prevented, apprentices trained. If it isn't counted, it won't compound.